pleased to be here today with Lisa Lucca, author of memoir Ashes to Ink. And before we get started, I just want to give a couple quick announcements. So if you could, please go to YouTube and subscribe. We're trying to just hit the first milestone for the show of getting 100 subscribers so that I'm able to customize the channel and give people something other than a big list of letters and numbers to go follow. So if you'd please go and hit subscribe, that would be really appreciated. Another thing that I'm trying to do with the show is gather all of the authors together who've been on the show to help promote their books. So I'm doing that through special links to bookshop.org. There's actually a store on bookshop.org called Author Talks. It lists most of the authors who've been on the show. And so if you see in the comments, you can follow the link to go to Bookshop, and it just helps to provide a little bit of support to Author Talks and also support local bookstores. So just wanted to give a quick commercial shout out for that. And Lisa is an author, life coach, and host of a weekly radio show called Live True. And Lisa, just so excited to have you here and talk about your book, Ashes to Ink.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it and really looking forward to talking about this with you.
Great.
So my first question is, so when did you know that you had to write this memoir?
I actually knew in my teens, probably at 15 and 16, I wrote in a journal. I remember writing even a cover, fairy tale nightmare. It was very dramatic. And I was very clear that this was a story I had to put out to not feel so alone, because that was one of the things that happened in the 70s when my dad came out that was so difficult, was the fact that I didn't have anyone else that I could talk to or a book that someone could hand to me.
Absolutely. So at what age did you find out that your father was gay, and what impact did that have?
I was just turned 14, and it was something that I sort of figured out by osmosis, and yet I don't really know where I absorbed that information except for Archie Bunker on TV. It was a very taboo subject. And when I found out or figured it out and asked my mother and she confirmed it, it was really devastating to me, because it just felt like my father wasn't the same person anymore. So I had a really negative reaction, and he had a very sort of clinical response to it, which was, go to the library and read about homosexuality to find out that I'm perfectly normal, which was not a really normal thing to tell a child, really. And keeping in mind that 14 in 1974 was like 10 today. We were much less savvy about the world, and certainly about sexuality. That was not something that was talked about in my house. And certainly it wasn't something you want to think about your parents.
Absolutely. And I love the way that right at the beginning of your book, you give, kind of a disclaimer about that too, of essentially just trying to set the stage that it may be harder for people who didn't live through, the 70s or 80s or even early 90s or beyond to realize, just what a stigma, an openly negative stigma and words that were used to describe homosexual people.
Yep.
And or people of any, different sexuality other than heterosexuality, for sure. And so I like the way that you acknowledge that up front, and you also just clarify that when you're talking about those experiences in the past, that you're saying, these were the kinds of negative words that I was being fed. This is why, it caused me to feel this way, about my dad. And so I think you just paint a really good picture of that helps, helps people to understand.
Thank you. It was really, really clear to me that those words were not words we use today, certainly not in media. I mean, this was on network television, back when there were 4 channels. And I went to a couple of different organizations and asked their thoughts about it, whether they felt that it was important to use the words of the day or to whitewash it, so to speak. And I was very happy to hear that once they read my disclaimer, that it was appropriate for me to be honest.
Well, and I think that helps just to clarify, that negative atmosphere and the, very closeted environment, very risky and negative and demeaning and all those kinds of things, unfortunately, that were given to such, a group of people.
Yeah, I mean, that was part of the stigma, and also the fact that I was sworn to secrecy, which meant that it must be bad, which then meant that Dad must be bad. If there was this thing that I couldn't talk about that was connected to my father, and my mother was very quiet about it, didn't want to talk about it at all. She was very uncomfortable, yet she still had a positive relationship with my dad, and he was very open. So when he's with his first partner that we were introduced to, who was much younger than him, closer to my age than his age, it was really unsettling because, again, if he had gone and dated another woman after Mom, even a younger woman, it would have been uncomfortable, but not nearly as uncomfortable as seeing him with Terry.
Well, and it seems like something that you capture early on in the book after finding out that your dad is gay is that you have kind of a sense of isolation that like you said, you're sworn to secrecy, but your mother is somehow kind of at peace with this, at least seemingly so. And then your younger sister kind of was out of the loop. And so that's why she felt, more comfortable to go and spend time with your dad and with Terry. So is that something, that you can talk a little bit more about, kind of how that made you feel at the time?
It was really, I was in all that teenage angst anyway, and I'm a really emotional girl to begin with. So I just emoted all the time. And my sister is much more of a private person, a little bit more able to be contained with her emotions in a way that also is in another thread of the book. As we become adults, we're very different emotionally. And so my sister, I was a little jealous of her ignorance because she got to just go, and she was 11, 12, she was young enough that it wasn't on her radar at all. And she just was happy to spend time with Dad. And she ultimately comes out in the book. And so there was a kinship there that was a little bit difficult for me there was always something that connected them differently than he and I, although it didn't make it any easier for her. She has said often that it was more difficult for her to come out because she watched how Dad had different people judge him and reject him when he did.
Wow, that's really interesting. Well, and I know the scene too where you call your mom at work after finding out, and you immediately want to talk about this, and of course she's like, "I'm at work, like we can't talk about this right now."
Poor thing, I know.
Did you have sort of meaningful conversations with your mom after that, after she wasn't at work, or was it kind of a quick clarifier and then just sort of moving on?
Probably more the latter. She was uncomfortable talking about difficult topics, and she wanted to retain her relationship with my dad. I think her biggest thing was, he's your father and you need to respect him. And she likes to keep the peace. And so nobody went to the library and got me a book and said, here, understand, or let's sit down and talk about this. My dad said, go to the library and read about homosexuality. Well, which I would have been mortified to walk in and, have that little card stamped by the librarian. Back then, it wasn't a kiosk, right? So
yeah, why are you reading this? And what does this mean? And do you have wait, what?
I didn't find one in our little, Midwest suburban library at the time. I'm not even sure it wouldn't have been just some sort of clinical textbook or something. So I think that was another reason why I always felt like I would write this story from a family standpoint, and also about that feeling of being ostracized, and then just also being someone who talks out her feelings. I always was one that wanted to, beat it with a dead horse. So my mother and my sister, have had a harder time with that. My father, I was very uncomfortable to talk to him about it because it was about him. And, you just don't want to think about sexuality in your parents at all. And there it is, right in the middle of the word, that I couldn't think about my dad and his new partner without it becoming a sexual sort of, taboo subject, because it wasn't about him having a new partner. It was about him having a new life.
Well, and I think, an interesting thing that happens at the beginning too is after you and your sister accompany him and Terry, and, since Terry was younger, you all more, we're like, oh, he's cute. And I was like, ooh, kind of a thing. So that was kind of an interesting element too, I'm sure, to just be like, well, like, wait, we're attracted to this person, but wait, now this person's with dad. Like, what?
Yeah, it was really difficult. And he, he was young and immature. He was in his very early 20s, my dad's partner, Terry. So he wasn't in any position to have any sensitivity towards this teenage girl, and so he flaunted their relationship a little bit more and wanted to make sure that I knew that dad, that he was number one in dad's eyes. And there is a scene in the book when dad gets quite ill that Terry comes in to my room because I've gotten ill as well. So we're in the same hospital. And he makes a really good point to say, now your dad is, loves me very much. And so it was awkward. It was really, really awkward.
I think you capture that well in that scene too. And honestly, again, of any gender, how you would feel having, your parent's partner come in and essentially be telling you almost like, I'm more important than you are. Yeah. I supersede you. Like, regardless of gender, that's a really uncomfortable statement, and one that, again, I'm sure served to push you further away from your father.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I couldn't be around them without thinking about their relationship in a way that was just really, really difficult. And even older, beyond my teen years, when I was in my 20s, and it wasn't until midlife just about that I finally felt much more comfortable with my dad when he met his final partner, Benny. And that was a very difficult thing for me when I was younger, because it was just not something that I had ever encountered. And I didn't know anyone else who had the same situation, except for my little sister, who I couldn't talk to about it.
Well, and I also think that in your book, you make great points as well about how, especially back in the 70s and 80s, even your dad suggesting for you to go to the library and read about it, as you say, it probably would have been something clinical. It would have been in, the book of the DVSM or whatever that is, for psychological disorders. It would not have been, again, more like what you were saying, that, when you're looking for Father's Day cards for your dad and feeling like, oh, where's the, my dad is gay card? Like, what do I, my gay dad, like, what's going, how do I find that information? And how, like, there's no manual for this. There aren't any resources. So how did you feel like, that affected you, or how were you able to overcome that?
Well, all I really wanted was to talk about it really openly and not be feeling so embarrassed. So I sort of sought out my own counsel through a youth organization that was an after-school program, and it was one of I think there were social workers that were doing their hours, their intern hours, and talking to the kids in the church basement after school that had problems. And so I worked with her. I met a woman, Nancy, and she was probably in her mid-20s. She was young too, but she was so helpful because she listened and she let me cry and she let me get angry, and I was able to at least process my feelings with someone who wanted me to understand that these are still my parents, and parents are people too. And I think that's the other thread in my book that takes the reader all the way through my own adulthood and single parenthood. And sort of at the heart of the book is this concept of parents as people and how they navigate love and sexuality with their kids as parents, especially single parents. When you're, getting divorced in your 30s, in my case, I was 35. My dad and I sort of tracked age-wise, in terms of, he and my mom got divorced when he was 34. And so that's young to not think you're going to ever have another romantic relationship. And yet when you're a parent, everything is filtered through that role. And it's really, really hard to separate that. And my father, I can look back and say, well, he's a 34-year-old man who's finally come into his own as who he is, and he's living his life openly for the first time ever. And then, his teenage daughter was not the most important thing on his mind at that point. And I get that is not necessarily true for all parents, but when you're the 14-year-old kid, you think you're the center of the universe. So that's
Absolutely.
kind of what I expected of him. And it took until I was a mother of a 14-year-old and still dating, then I could actually see how that works in terms of trying to have an individuality along with being a parent. And I think it's a balancing act.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to everyone who's watching live. Just want to say that real quick. And I've got a question, so I'm just going to pop that up here from Juanita Mance, who's also been on the show. And she just says, period pieces are something I love, especially in memoir, because they are organic. What devices did you use to set the time, place in the book? And how did you find your authentic younger voice?
Well, I had a couple of journals. One of my first diaries was a really helpful tool to just get back in my headspace right around the time I was 14 and into 15. And music and photographs. I found that, the more I listened to the music from that era, there's a mention of Cat Stevens and that album Tea for the Tillerman, and I listened to it over and over, and Sad Lisa, and that really helped me get into that mode. But also their touchstones I use in the actual story to keep the reader understanding where we are in time and also culture.
And what about, tapping into your younger voice and kind of trying to write from that place? How did that work for you?
Well, I got to say, once I was in that space with the music and the photographs, and I think you got to just keep at it. It's draft after draft. And for me, that little journal that I found from that period of how I expressed myself, it was always with a lot of emotion. So it was either the best day of my life or the worst day of my life.
Sure.
So using that voice, that helped me get into my youth voice.
Well, I know at one point in the book you mentioned, throwing out a lot of your old journals because you didn't necessarily want, your son or other people to go back and kind of view you during this time and view you as, this wounded girl who, was kind of acting out, sexually and things like that and processing things. So is that something that, in retrospect, like, are you still happy that you did that? Would it have made the writing easier to have not discarded all those journals?
I wish I had them. And it was probably probably less than 10, maybe 6 or 7 from my 20s, a lot of wine drenched, scribbly, crying, And I was in my last month of pregnancy, hugely hormonal, really, really like, my unborn baby's never going to read this. I was nesting and cleaning closets, and that's when I found them. So there were moments when I wished that I had had them, but there were vivid enough memories that I was able to go back and recreate that. And in fact, that period of time isn't a really long period of time. I did have the journals from when I went on the road. So those journals and of meeting my son's father. So I had all those. So it really was only for a very short period of maybe 3 or 4 years.
So are you still glad that you got rid of those as far as,
Well, I think I wish I had them actually.
Yeah. But that's interesting too about the context of, like you said, being pregnant and hormonal and going and again thinking of things in a different light and going, oh, I don't want my son to go read this.
Right. Exactly. And I did know it was a boy by then, but it was not pretty. And I was fine with the fact that I let them go. But yeah, there were moments when I thought, gosh, I wish I had that one from when I was 22, because I think I probably wrote about that scene where I'm with my dad when he first moves to San Francisco. And I probably would have had a little better depth, but I remembered it very vividly. So I was able to write that. That's probably one of my favorite scenes in the whole book.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's a really interesting element of the book too, about, the decision that your dad makes to move to San Francisco after a very brief
A weekend.
Right. A weekend with someone who he met and kind of fell head over heels for, right? And
yeah. Which made no sense to myself or my mother or my sister. And, we couldn't talk him out. We didn't even try to talk him out of it. There was just no way that was going to happen. So he ended up following me to the city that I was like so happy to be in by myself without any of my past. So it was another layer of our story, because then I watched him really bloom into, a homosexual man in the Castro in San Francisco in the 80s, which was like a whole different layer with AIDS and everything else. So it was challenging.
Do you think that your father had any idea, I'm guessing probably not, about how you discovering that he was gay and then also having, a barrier then between the development of your relationship with him, and then sort of how that affected you as far as your dating and sexual life? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, my father was a really generous man in a lot of ways. He was a genius, really, really, really smart. But he had a pretty strong narcissistic streak. So his capacity for empathy was very low. So he couldn't really put himself in my shoes or anyone else's for that matter. That was a really difficult part of our relationship, was I wanted to be understood, and he was always wanting me to understand him. It was always about him. So it was a difficult thing, and I ended up, of course, like many women do, attracting the same kind of person as my dad. And so a lot of my relationship struggles were with men who were somewhat indifferent and selfish, and it was all about them. So I think that was one of the bigger imprints that my father had on me, regardless of sexuality, was his disposition and his lack of really wanting to understand me and what I needed. And there are a couple scenes in the book that are really small things about a ride to the airport or moving furniture that he just, it's not even in his view at all to show up with that kind of leave it to beaver father thing.
And I think I think you capture that really well too. These kind of small heartbreaking moments between a father and a daughter where, you wanted to ask for his help, but you didn't want to have to ask. You wanted him to just get it. And like you said, when you're talking about being, kind of low on cash, or the ride to the airport, or I was kind of hoping that he would, understand that, like, I need a car, but I don't want to ask him. I want him to just offer. And so that's really interesting too, just to see how that comes together as well. And also as a reader, breaks my heart for you too, of just going, gosh, that. And again, I think sometimes, that communication between fathers and daughters can be difficult at times, for daughters to try to ask for what they need or tell their dad what they need, but also just hoping that they'll somehow magically get it, and know that sometimes we want more emotional support, or we want, like you said, we want them to help with things that we just feel like a dad should help with.
That showing up piece, I think, is really important. And I think it's true of mothers too. There are a lot of people that have a similar dynamic. And again, this story centers on my complicated relationship with my dad, who was gay, but it's about anybody who's had a complicated family dynamic that either included a secret or some dysfunction that made it difficult to communicate with their family members, and that we truly are released from that anxiety most when we find some sort of acceptance, which is not the same as forgiveness. The acceptance piece is pretty universal to find peace. The forgiveness piece is another layer to that, but I think the acceptance is a foundation. And that was my biggest struggle, was wishing he would change at some point into someone who would show up in the ways that I wanted to or expected him to. And then when I was a single mom, wanting desperately to have a father figure in my son's life, because his wasn't around at all. And that made it even harder, because it caused more drama than it solved in many situations. But that whole piece about fatherhood versus motherhood, fatherhood is like a uniform. I think I say this in the book. It's a uniform you can take off, even if you have to wear it every single day, all day, every day. You can take it off. Motherhood feels like a second skin that you just carry around with you no matter what. And so it was easier for my father to dismiss us when he wasn't with us, in a way that was difficult for me as a single mom with my son. And I think that's probably just, there's something really primal about that with the motherhood connection to their kids.
Absolutely. That idea that motherhood is 24/7, and that, men are sometimes, rewarded for kind of like doing the smallest thing,
Babysitting their kids.
right? Babysitting, or, oh, I'm leaving work to go get my sick kid. And it's like, well, good for you. But, moms do this all the time. You don't deserve an Academy Award for this just because, so again, I think that's something that we're still, working through in our culture too. I think, to try to understand that, like you said, it's just not the same. There's just not.
Not at all. Not at all. And that's, I think, why my mother felt like she could be the model of what respectable post-marriage dating is, post-divorce dating, where, and that what my father was doing, she couldn't stop us from going there, and she couldn't stop him from, having us there while he was, sleeping in his bed with his boyfriend. But my mother would have never done that. That was just never going to happen. So the confusion piece started early about what that actual, and it isn't even just morality, it's just exposure to something that is actually a natural part of life. I mean, today it would be a very different thing. Orientation isn't as big a factor. I've been doing things like this in the community for the LGBTQ family community. And, it's lovely that there's people are being raised by people who fell in love with people that they want to spend the rest of their life with, and they're going to start a family and be parents. I've often wondered what would that have been like to not have after 10 years, 14 years, that my family is now a completely different couple of people. My parents are completely different in so many ways.
That's really interesting. Well, and I think one of the phrase that really stuck with me from your book was when you described that difference between how your mother and your father handled, their sexuality and relationships, romantic relationships. And you said, it was almost like a velvet curtain, was in between you and your mother's world of that. And that, again, she was, took more of a chaste approach and was more just dating, but there was really no sort of evidence or whatever of any sexual interaction. And when you say that with your father, it was more like a sheer gossamer, that was all that was separating that, because of, again, more the open flirting or the comments and things like that again made you very uncomfortable and made you not want to hang out with your dad and his partner at the time.
Yeah, it was really confusing to me. And then again, there was a certain curiosity or an exotic as I got older into my 20s and beyond, where I had always felt like I would have an unusual, sort of extraordinary life. And I didn't want to have a really, quote, normal everyday life. Starting at a fairly young age, I had big dreams, and I mentioned, which really dates me, but that Mary Tyler Moore and That Girl, those shows of women going off into the world and moving away from home and having their own apartment, and that was everything to me. I couldn't wait to have that exciting cosmopolitan life. So I kind of, once I got older, it became a story that became easy to tell at, bar conversation or a cocktail party, about having a gay dad, and a couple of the stories that went along with that. Because I learned that once it wasn't a secret anymore, and once I started understanding that this is my father becoming true to who he is, it wasn't such a big deal after all. The bigger deals were his innate personality that was indifferent or dismissive, that had nothing to do with his sexuality.
Well, and I think it's really interesting too how you're very open about, the challenges that you had, as a teenager, both in wanting to flee the coop and, not be at home with your mother, whom you were often arguing with, and then also having, this, developing, sexuality and often looking, to boys for, hoping for love. Yep, love, acceptance, validation, all those things that you felt, you weren't getting from your father. And like you said, regardless of sexuality, I think that's something that, a lot of people deal with for sure. And, being able to look back on their past and go, oh, okay, so these are, some of the ways that this affected me.
Absolutely. And, also knowing that what the norms were, the 70s, were love the one you're with, until you're, the Carpenters are singing you down the aisle with your floppy hat.
Right.
It was a very different world in terms of what sexual norms were. It was the post 60s free love. And of course, this was only hitting the Midwest at that period of time. So from 75 to 80, the formative teen years, there was a lot of confusion. We were just starting to talk about sex openly, period, So having all of this on the heels of that was a very interesting time for me. And, seeking out reading books. I find Fear of Flying in my mother's nightstand,
Right.
and there's and so there are just little cultural, again, with the cultural references of where we were in time. And that book took the world by storm, that she was so open. And it was a very, very different world. And yet I can go back and see that so many of the wounds came from how it was dealt with, not the actual content of the family dynamic. If anything, it's talk to your kids, be open with your kids, let them understand things that you think that you don't want them to do, but it's important that they know what this world is about, because it can really blindside you if you don't know, and then you're faced with a situation you don't understand.
Well, and I think you described that, as you said, really well in your book when you're talking about the, kind of the free love movement, also mixed with, like you said, walking down the aisle in your floppy hat to "We've only just begun," and it's kind of like, wait, so which person am I supposed to be exactly? Like, what's going on here? And I think too, like you say, calling out those cultural references that were real touchstones for you. That, like you said, you were more interested in being Rhoda, necessarily than Mary from the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And again, I think we all have those things that we watch certain shows and idealize certain people and thought that certain things would be our life, or we wanted them, to be our lives. I grew up wanting to be a detective after watching Laura Holt on Remington Steele. So, I mean, those things are very real, and it attracted me to, delving in and mystery and all those kinds of things. So those are real things.
That's great. Yeah. Well, it is. And that's where we learn who we want to be. That might be different from where we come from. And those women, Mary and Rhoda and Anne Marie, all showed me a way of being in the world that was, beyond your immediate family. But at the core, they all still wanted love. They were all looking for a husband.
Sure.
So that was a big part of my generation's, double-edged sword, that there was, freedom and love the one you're with, and, there was a whole self-absorbed part of that, me generation. But then everybody at the end of the day loved the romantic stuff, I mean,
Right.
even Laura Holt.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I think you convey in the book too that you're really holding back a lot in your communication with your dad, and that you hold it back for a long time. So when was it that you felt like you really kind of started to open that conversation with him, or was it something that just kind of burst out that you couldn't hold back anymore?
Well, I think when I first really sort of had a big discussion with him, I was in my early 20s, and when he had moved just recently to San Francisco. And, he made the mistake of opening a bottle of White Zinfandel back in the day. And so the more I drank, the more I kind of let him have it, with all the things that I wanted to say for a really long time about what I perceived as him compromising my mother's sexuality. And, here she was a good girl, 19-year-old Italian Catholic virgin, when she got married, and she did everything right. And she found a nice man in high school that she really liked, and they were best friends, and they had a beautiful wedding. And, everything about what my mom did was what she was supposed to do. And I felt like he knew all along that this is who he was, and he just wanted a certain lifestyle and picked the person he thought he could have that with for the rest of his life. So I do really understand the love that my parents had for one another, and it really is a thread throughout the whole book. But when I finally started talking about my feelings about all of it, I was in my 20s, and, I would pay for any outburst of my opinion because no one did that with my dad. He was used to being the smartest person in the room and the last word. So nobody really pushed up against him like I did. And he, being a person who did not like criticism, had a hard time with being told anything that wasn't an agreement of his beliefs. So the older I got, the more I was willing to do that, and about any kind of different situation. And it wasn't only in regards to his orientation. That once I was out of my 20s, I mean, that's just became a fact of life and who my father is. But as time went by over years and years, and my relationship with my parents and them to one another, there always seemed to be that they were somehow in cahoots and connected in a deeper way than I felt with either one of them, actually.
Well, and it seems like, it would make sense for you to, at some point, raise that issue with your dad, in caring about your mom, and in wanting to, be honest about, like, well, almost like the, what did you know and when did you know it, kind of conversation with him. I mean, that's very understandable to me that you would want to, at least ask the question and kind of defend your mom a little bit, and be like, well, wait a minute, like, and how did that conversation go with him?
It didn't go very well. He got very, very defensive. It was great for me to voice my thoughts and feelings, and what came out of that conversation, that initial conversation in San Francisco, was how he had been acting on his relationship with another mutual friend of theirs for, since they were young. And so there was another layer exposed when I did that interrogation, and that was devastating because it colored my childhood in a different light, because now I would go back and think of all those, Monday nights that Dad was out, that I then had to revision my childhood, where I thought, where we thought Dad was bowling, right? So it was not that he had suppressed this his whole life and decided at one point in time, this is who I am, and it just hit him. He told me once, when we had a more frank conversation and not so heated, that, he remembered at 9 years old going to see Tarzan in the movie theater with his buddies, 9 or 10. And they were all like googly eyed over Jane. And he felt kind of googly about Tarzan. So it was an innate, which I truly believe, that sexual orientation is something we come into the world with, and it's not something that gets, trained or coerced or anything like that. It's
Right.
it's an instinct like any other, anybody else's sexual response. So that was really interesting to me to learn that this was his orientation all along. The sad thing was that my parents got separated when I was 10, and this happens before the beginning of the book. I reference it just for a second, but my parents got separated when I was 10, and Dad moved out, and it was after Mom and Dad had a little conversation down. They had a couple over for dinner, and about a half hour after they left, it was a colleague of my dad's and his wife. The phone rang, and Dad ran down to the basement to answer it, which, right past the kitchen phone, to go to the basement. And she sat at the top of the steps and listened, and he was just cooing in the phone like a schoolgirl. And she just thought he was talking to the wife. I think it went really well. And so as he came up the stairs, she asked him, who are you talking to? And he's like, I was talking to Rex. And she's like, no, I think you're talking to a woman. And he's like, no, I was talking to Rex. And at that moment, he revealed to her that he had homosexual tendencies and that he was exploring them, and very matter of fact. And she asked him to leave. And from that period for the next year, they were separated. And of course, it was really hard financially. You know, they're 30 years old. You know, they're really young.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother went first to her priest, who said, keep your family together at all costs. And then she went to a psychiatrist who said that Dad was going through a phase, and that if she lost weight, maybe he'd come back, and sent her to a diet doctor who gave her pills. So these men all counseled my mother to believe that this was about her, and that if she,
lovely.
this is so, and I didn't, you know, it's funny with memoir, you can't have a scene that you're not in.
Right.
In a memoir. So I originally had that scene and talked about this, and it didn't work. And this is where you have to, you know, kill your darlings. You decide what story is yours to tell. But I knew that I could share this. It's a very important piece of the story, because I think that for women in the 60s and 70s, that they listened to men. Men had the power, and the only woman who had any power in that era for them was our pediatrician, was a woman. And I loved that. I loved that I had a lady doctor, you know.
Sure.
She had a cigarette in her mouth the whole time. She was taking something completely different.
Again, the era for sure.
But so it was really interesting how my mother went through this transformation, and she did everything that these men, and my dad came back, and he came back for all the wrong reasons. They were more financial, and he missed his family, and it was just not okay to be out. So why should I be over here when I could be here? And so he came home, and we bought a new house in Oak Park, and that's when we moved. And we were there for 3 years before he started going back out again. And that's when he told my mother, and then they got divorced.
I'm going to just interject. We've got a question here on the chat from Cindy Neisinger. Thanks again, Cindy, for watching. So she says, how did you come up with the title?
You know, I had several working titles over the years. The book took me several years to write. And because the book begins and ends with my father's ashes as sort of a character in the book, as it were, I really liked the concept of using ashes in the title. And when I got his ashes and I wanted to keep a little, I went looking for the right little vessel, and I found an inkwell. And one of the things that my dad was always really proud of me as a writer. I didn't write professionally, but I did write my websites, or when I'd write an article when I became a life coach. So he really liked my writing. And then my partner and I published a book several years ago called You Are Loved. And so my father was one of our beta readers, and he wrote our first Amazon review, which was really cool. So I thought that inkwell, which has sat on my desk the whole time I've been writing the book, ashes to ink. I love the feather, and I wanted a reference to having something connected to the LGBT community, but I didn't want it to be overtly in the title. And so I thought that the rainbow feather was a good way to sort of have a little reference to it. And so that's how the title was born.
Well, and I think the ashes to ink, there's, I think multiple things there too, that, with your father's ashes and the literal inkwell, but then also just, kind of this, trauma and destruction and unhealthy patterns in your life, and then how you were able to transform that and birth that into something positive and beautiful, which is this book.
Thank you. Well, yeah, that does feel like that, out of the phoenix of the ashes of my tragic story that came writing. And the writing isn't just the actual finished product of having a book. It was so cathartic to write it.
Mm.
It was a really powerful healing. And also with my family. My mother and my sister were not happy that I was writing this, 7, 8 years ago, and even up to 5 years ago, maybe. But over the last few years, my sister and I have had more conversations, and she's a bigger character in the book in the second thread of the sort of present day. There's a little thread of the book from the time my dad dies until I scatter his ashes. And my sister, I was really concerned about how she would feel about it, but she actually found more understanding of me by reading this book than she had previously. And we've had a huge healing from this process. So when people ask me how hard it is to have your family be involved with you writing something like this, I just say write it, and then later you can share it. You can, I didn't want to, there's no malice towards anyone in this story, really. I throw myself under every other bus. And so I don't feel like anyone could take issue. I did not consult all my exes, but everyone's name and location and stuff has changed. But I think that it's a really, it's a cathartic process to just write it down. So that's part of what the ink part for me is the healing of writing it.
Well, and I really like that disclaimer that you give, at the beginning too, that is essentially saying, as you mentioned, that it's like, I'm not writing this out of malice for anyone. Names and dates have, been changed, but this is also, my memories and my recollection. And I understand that the other people involved in this may have different memories. And, I was screenshotting that thinking like, I'm going to need to use, similar wording in my own memoir, because I think that, again, that's something that really kind of, I think, frees you up as a memoir writer to be like, this is my story, my perspective, my memories, and it's okay for me to own that and share that. And again, I'm not doing this to, get revenge or get back at anyone. It's more just me sharing my, life story or parts of it.
Yeah, the thread of it. And you're absolutely right. I mean, this is, our memories, it's a slippery thing, and they're not, we have writing dialogue, writing place, what you're wearing. Some things came from literal photographs. And so I can say that I was wearing, whatever, the jeans and the sandals or whatever. But if I thought too hard about what I was saying in the conversation about whether or not it sounded good, it sounded too clinical. The biggest thing is to write freely about what you believe that heart of that conversation was, and then go in and you can fine tune it, but knowing that you're not making it up, you're sort of unlocking it, and then trusting that it's the essence of what that conversation was. And that's sort of how I wrote all the dialogue in the book.
Has the book, I know you mentioned that it's, opened up healing, more for your family and especially for like you and your sister. Would you say that it has for your mother as well? And have you ever been able to kind of have the open conversations about her, her sadness and devastation and I'm sure anger, on a certain level too, because as you said, your parents definitely maintained more of a placid friendship, caring, respectful relationship. And so I can understand your feelings of like, Mom, like, aren't you angry or how, he did this to you. And again, those are kind of, the elements that your dad didn't want to hear about and was resentful of you bringing up. But,
over the years, we have had a few conversations here and there. She doesn't like to talk about it. Her go-to response is, it happened. Get out, just move on. You don't have to talk about it all the time. She doesn't understand my need to really dig down and get to the bottom of things. She's more up here at the surface. And so we've had a couple of really frank conversations. When I was doing the book, she softened towards the last couple of years and allowed me to ask her more questions because she's got a really good memory. And so, when I shared the manuscript with her about a year ago, and it wasn't the very final, it was pretty close though. She read it and she said it was really hard for me. She didn't want to talk about it though. She just said, it's beautifully written and it was really hard for me to read. And, you made me cry. I'm like, okay. And that's, it's lovely and it's sweet for her. And of course, those are difficult. I don't know how I would feel if my son wrote a book about his parents and, that devastation of when we divorced and, how difficult that was. He was really, really young. He was only 3, but I don't know how I would feel. So I could only just be gracious and say, was there anything you can't live with? And there wasn't. She was neither one of my family members. My 93-year-old aunt, though, she loved it. She thought it was fantastic.
Oh, that's great.
Which I thought was really cool.
Well, and I'm sure too, on your mother's part, I guess I shouldn't say that I'm sure, but I can imagine that if I were in her situation, I'm sure I would feel kind of some level of, embarrassment or, things like that too, of almost like, this happened to me. I'm not happy about it. I kind of just had to live with it, but obviously it's not the life, that she planned for. And it seems like at some point, your dad, let you know that too, that it was like, look, the expectation back then, in the 50s was you get married and you have a family. I wanted that. I didn't want to miss out on that. And I thought that was a really valid point too, that again, to say like, hey, I'm not the bad guy here. Like I didn't go into this trying to be deceptive or hurt your mother. Like I just thought that was a really interesting point.
Well, and it's true. He loved my mother and he took great care of her it to the very, very end. And so I completely understood by the time I was a true adult that, those were the circumstances of the time. These were the choices that he made and that she was fine with it. I do remember there were times that when my mom and I laughed about it a little bit when, we were, but way before I even moved away, where she said, hey, I was 20 years old and I had a baby and then I had another one at 23 and your dad would work all day. He was a pioneer in computers and she was a housewife and she took care of the house and the kids and he delivered pizzas at night. And so she was by herself doing all the work. And she said, I loved it. I had girlfriends I'd coffee clutch with and their husbands came home and they laid on the couch and watched the ball game and drank beer and chased him around for sex. And she's like, I felt great that your father came home and helped me do the dishes and, knew how to cook a meal and would watch,
was a great
Mary Tyler Moore at the end of the day in recliners, they watched, TV that was what a lot of the, women enjoyed. And so he was to her the perfect husband on some level because he wasn't another person to take care of, it was really interesting. So she had her pain in their divorce, obviously, and they were not instant best friends the day after their divorce. She took a minute to recalibrate her relationship to him, but at the same time, there was never any malice, and there was always an expectation by her that we love and respect him because he's our father.
Absolutely. Well, and those are valid points that in some ways he may have been a better match, for her kind of because of some of the traits that he had.
Well, that's exactly right. And so, she dated over the years. She had a couple of opportunities to remarry, and she didn't want to go back into being a domestic partner to anyone. She enjoyed her lifestyle at that point to live alone. And then once I moved back to Chicago after my divorce, and I was a single mom with my son, and we ended up buying a home together where she had an apartment in the back, which was very convenient and lovely in theory to have grandma right there, but that also meant having mom right there. So that was an interesting part of the journey as well.
Well, and you definitely indicate that you and your mother had a more cantankerous, relationship in your younger years, and that you didn't anticipate being able to, live with her when your son was young. So how did that sort of progress?
Well, it made sense. She was wanting to get out of the little house she had and have a little more support. And at the same time, I was in an apartment with Zach, and I didn't have an opportunity to buy something on my own. I left pretty much, with $100 and a 3-year-old when I left my marriage. So we found the perfect house, and it was a great thing, for 13 years. She got to grow up, watch her grandson, her only grandchild, grow up, in the same home where she got to see him every single day. And that was a beautiful thing for both of them. And so to me, it always felt like a gift to both of them. I didn't love living back where I came from. I found myself in exactly the life I ran from. So it was a very challenging time for me, but it made a lot of sense for all of us. And it gave me a certain amount of freedom that I wouldn't have had if she wasn't right there. So, it kind of feels like what was meant to be in a lot of ways. And so I went with it, but it wouldn't have been my first choice to certainly go back to where I left. But I did.
Well, and you also cover in your book how once you got married, you discovered that you really didn't want to have a spouse that you had to parent, essentially, and that wasn't an equal partner. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So I was in the entertainment industry, and I was able to go and travel. And I don't want to give too much away, but I met my ex-husband sort of in a I don't know, like being on The Bachelor kind of way. So that we were in a different city, and we had per diem, and we responsibilities, and he looked like Patrick Swayze. I mean, it's awesome. But reality was a whole different animal. And so by the time I moved with him to Nashville, and we got married and had a baby, and all that happened within less than 2 years, I woke up just to, this is my life now, and my big career is over, and he's not around. And I was in the South, and he was, hot honey, and he was sweet, but he had no intention of, taking care of me in the way that I thought I needed to be. So I was very disillusioned, and I had 2 stepchildren also. So it was a difficult time financially for us as well. And I had this baby that I adored and just loved so much. And yet I had to care for everything all the time because his dad was gone on the road most of the time. So it was a really difficult thing for me because I don't know. And again, you don't know what you don't know, right? So had he been there every day, maybe I would have had a different experience. I don't know that it would have changed some of the ways in which I was just not compatible with him in terms of interests and, you know, intellectually stimulating conversation. But I think at the end of the day, the separation was probably the biggest reason why I felt like a single mom anyway. And I needed to have support. I was so isolated, and I think it was really damaging to my mental health. I probably had postpartum depression, but again, nobody really talked about that. I just cried all the time. So it was difficult. And, I kind of feel like that, but he was meant to be my father's dad for sure. I mean, my son's dad for sure.
Mm.
I see my son and he's the best of both of us.
Mm. Very nice. Well, one question that we got from Cindy is, she says, AIDS was prevalent in that era. Did it impact you? She says, my brother is gay. His first partner died from it.
Oh,
Sorry
man.
about
I'm
that.
so sorry, Cindy. It did in a sense in that I lived in San Francisco at the height of the AIDS crisis. I was a producer on In Concert Against AIDS, which was a big fundraising telethon that I did with some of the people that I worked with. My father, he had an illness and a surgery when he was younger that made him a little less, without TMI, just a little less exposed. Yet at the same time, his behavior and his lifestyle in the 80s was such that he was definitely vulnerable. And I did worry about it quite a bit, although I think there was a hypervigilance with my dad in which I always at the back of my mind kept thinking, but he'll be okay, he'll be okay. And he survived it, but not without a lot of grief with other friends of his that didn't.
One thing that came through in the book for me was noticing how later on, when we find out that your sister is a lesbian, how accepting you are of that, and how much you're essentially saying, like, yeah, I kind of wondered about that, but how you're able to accept that more easily and understand, like, okay, so this is a piece of who she is, but it really doesn't affect me in any way. Do you think that, having a sister who, ended up being a lesbian gave you kind of a more better understanding, I guess, like in retrospect of your dad?
That's a really good question, Jane. I felt very different, and of course by then it was the early 90s, so it was a whole different impact because it was a little tiny bit more socially quote unquote acceptable, but here's the thing, her being gay didn't impact me at all. And she was a single young woman and going into her relationship world as a gay woman. And my father made choices that required him to be duplicitous and to lie and hide a secret that then, when he chose to reveal it, created a lot of disruption to a lot of people. So when my sister came out, it was easier, quote unquote, because we already had dad in the family, but it didn't bother me. I think the real crux of it with my dad was we got more in trouble for lying than anything else. Whatever we did, we were in trouble, but we were in more trouble if we lied about it. So I just saw the lying and the betrayal piece as so egregious because it was, what I got in so much trouble for. And I just felt like it was this huge act for my whole life, that my father, and he was an actor. He was in a lot of musical theater. And so I felt like that persona of him was just somebody, and then he just became this person. He looked different and he acted different and he had different friends and he wore different clothes, and suddenly I didn't even know who he was, where my sister was just still the same girl.
Well, and that's an important point too, that again, just because it's another close family member in your life doesn't mean that it's going to have the same impact, because the circumstances were different. They approached it completely differently. As you say, there was a bit more openness in the early 90s. So that's a valid point too, that it's almost kind of an apples and oranges. Like, yeah, I accepted it easier, but it didn't have the impact. And there also wasn't the embedded hypocrisy of, don't lie, but here I was lying about this for years, and there was a lot of betrayal involved.
Well, exactly. And I think it's true of any story. Again, my father's sexual orientation is just what my wound started with, but it was always the betrayal and the selfishness and the fact that his life and what he was experiencing was always more important, right? So regardless of what our family of origin trauma might have been, it might have been that somebody, that there was infidelity, or someone was alcoholic, or there was some other gambling secret, anything that it gets revealed as an underlying sort of toxic piece of the cultural of the family, can create those wounds. So again, my sister didn't matter because she wasn't hurting anybody. Mm-hmm. And I always looked at my father's situation as having pretended and lied to us and hurting my mother the way that he did, when in fact, he did what he felt he needed to do at the time, what was expected of him at the time, and then became true to who he is at a time in his life when he couldn't pretend any longer. And that took a long time for me to figure out, but now it's sort of part and parcel of the work that I do, which is a nice full circle.
Do you think that your father ever acknowledged, either to himself or anyone else, how much, he had hurt your mother and hurt you?
No. In his mind, he never meant to hurt anyone, and it's there, even on the back of the little card from the funeral home, he had exactly what he wanted on the back of that card in his wallet for a long time, which was kind of creepy, actually. And he was very clear. One is a Barbara Stanwyck quote, which I thought was really funny, but he talked about, I never meant to hurt anyone deliberately in my life. And he really believed that he didn't hurt anyone. He had a blind spot about his culpability in another's pain, because he's just, well, but I'm just being myself, and I told you the truth. Now you should be fine with the truth. And my mother, he took very good care of throughout the years. So no. And when I get to a place in my life where I'm able to forgive him for a lot of the ways in which I felt that he had not shown up for me, he doesn't reply. He doesn't acknowledge it. And so we never did get to that place. But forgiveness and acceptance doesn't have to have the other person's participation or even acknowledgement for it to be incredibly liberating.
I know you make that point in the book as well, when you realize that it wasn't about so much, that agreement or that acceptance or forgiveness between the two of you, but that it was more like, I'm doing this for myself. I'm doing this, the the acceptance and the forgiveness and the working through all these feelings, this is a gift to me. And it seems so many times like that's the message about forgiveness. Is it's not saying it's okay. It's not, necessarily, it's not about the other person. It's like the gift you give yourself.
Yeah, I think, and as a life coach, I talk to people a lot about where they feel a need for forgiveness and forgive themselves and be forgiven. All the forgiveness comes up a lot. And what I really want to always remind people is that even when we forgive someone, it doesn't let them off the hook for whatever it is that we want to forgive them for. It doesn't mean that they're no longer responsible for their actions or their words or whatever. It just means that you let down the heavy burden of the resentment that it comes with. And that's a huge message I want readers to take away from my story, is that, our deepest wounds can be the resentment we carry against someone else. And, I did a lot. And it isn't always pretty, and I really tried to be very honest about what that was like for me. And in my next book, I'll talk more about it too. There's a pretty significant time jump from that moment that you were just referencing to the last chapter of the book. So I'm already underway on my next one to sort of pick up part of that, and the love story that's sort of threaded in there too.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to that. That sounds great. And I'm interested in your previous memoir too, that you wrote with your partner, called You Are Loved. That also sounds really interesting as well.
It's an epistolary book, which means it's told completely in letters. And actually, it's literally only in letters and emails that span about 10 years back and forth to another. But it really does tell our story. So having been introduced to Mark in this book, it's kind of fun for readers to read more of that, because it goes a lot deeper and also into those other years that got skipped over. But between sort of the climax of the story and then, the resolution, as memoir has to do. You just can't be in the whole lifespan. You have to sort of keep it within a condensed time frame.
Sure. Well, how long would you say, that it took you to write this book, and what was your process like? What writing techniques or, schedule or elements or whatever, what worked well for you?
I want to say it took it took 7 years to get from the beginning to the end, as it were, to get it out into the world. The actual writing the book was probably about 3 or 4 years of, really getting it out. I wrote the prologue. I wrote at Esalen in Big Sur at a writer's retreat, and then it and I used that as an essay, and I knew it was the beginning of my book, but I used that as an essay, and I submitted it around, and it won an award, and I was able to use pieces of the book. I think that's a really good way to put your name and your words out there, is to write pieces if you're working on a long form. And I didn't write every day. I'd go in spurts. I took a lot of classes. I read a lot of books, Marion Roach and anything by Brooke Warner and Linda Joy Myers. And I worked with Laura Munson, who's an author. I worked with a lot of different people and organizations, that I, over the years, have followed. National Association of Memoir Writers has a lot of podcasts that you can listen to of how people have done this, shows like yours. I completely immersed myself in the memoir world, read, took little webinars. But the writing itself, I would I would sit and write for several hours when I could. I think it's better than trying to do 20 minutes at a time. And I write better in the afternoon to early evening for some weird reason, between noon and 6. And then revision, revision, revision. I mean, getting that first draft out when it was crappy, just getting the whole story out. And then it was really long, and peer groups, having peer readers. And, one of my friends, she's like, this is where your book ends. And why are there 70 more pages? And so those 70 pages are sitting over here, to be woven into the next book, but so I just kept at it and then hired people to help me. I hired a good editor, and I really tried really hard to get an agent, and I had nibbles, and I had a wonderful pitch with HarperCollins, and she loved the book, but she didn't know how to champion it because it's not too old. It's not only 50 years ago, so it's not historical, but it's not relevant because it's not now. And, I mean, there are so many layers to getting published. And I had a contract with She Writes Press, and then COVID happened. And so that investment wasn't something that I felt it's a hybrid publisher. And so I just decided this was coming out in October of 21. That was my original pub date with She Writes. And so I said, I'm going to do this on my own. And
Good for you.
I hired cool people to help me. So I felt like I had a team, and I didn't do it alone. And I did the cover, and I loved the cover. I was really happy with the cover art, and my designer was great. He worked with me on my ideas and didn't try to, infuse it with too much of his stuff. He did the back and the interior, which was terrific.
Well, that's fantastic. And I think that it's a great example too, when you hear of someone, self-publishing their book, because that's something that, again, has, lost a lot of the stigma that it used to have in the past. It's really opened up a lot of possibilities for authors. And yet, as we were talking about before we got on today, it's still kind of that element of, we all still need to promote our work and market and all those kinds of things. So what are you finding, that works well for you as far as that goes?
Well, thank you, Jane. Things like this are terrific ways of talking about writing. I'm doing a lot of stuff. Zoom is great because you don't have to drive around or fly around. It's very cool to be able to reach so many people in one fell swoop. And social media, I have a pretty big following on Facebook. I tried to keep it to just one place. I do post on Instagram, but I didn't try to build them all up at the same time. It's overwhelming. It's a full-time job.
Absolutely.
It's so much work, but I promote other authors. I think having a really great community of authors is important. Know what your categories are. Know the little tricks. They give you 2 categories on Amazon, but if you write to them with the specific subcategories you want, you can get up to 8. So there's these little bitty tricks, and that's how I was able to get to #1 on the bestseller list for new releases in LGBT parenting and family and in single parents. And of course, as soon as new releases is over, you drop like a stone into the regular population. But it's still up at around in the top 10 usually for LGBT parenting and family, and those algorithms, and that's all really fun and nice. And I'm not, I really try to promote the independent book sellers more than Amazon. It's kind of a double-edged sword. You
Right.
want that exposure, and at the same time, I have most of my links on my website are all, indie bound, and I have your link for Bookshop, and
Oh, awesome.
yeah.
Good.
So, I really invite people to to purchase the book however they find it. If you Google my book, the first one that comes up is Target. I mean, it's all over the place. I did publish both through KDP for Amazon and Ingram so that I would be able to be in all of the other places as an actual author, like any other independent publisher would be. I have a small publishing imprint called Juju House Publishing, and
Notice that.
yeah, so I do work with memoir writers on my website. So, there is an opportunity, down the road that I may be actually publishing other people as well. If the right project came across my desk, I'm open to that too. I think, writers need the small imprints to help them get their book out and feel like they're being published, legitimately, as opposed to just, slapping a book together and putting it on Amazon. There's a lot of those out there. And I think when we have a really good product, having a little imprint makes a difference than just another CreateSpace book.
Well, and how were you able to figure out those categories that your book fell in when you had someone from HarperCollins saying, hey, I don't like this. It's great work, but I don't know how to market this. So how were you able to take those next steps, Lisa, and go, okay, let me figure out where this fits and who's my ideal reader or what categories this falls into?
Well, I sat down with a list of all the themes that my book really encompasses, which I think are, you can't have too many, but, LGBTQ family, single parenting, dysfunctional families, motherhood, those are the kinds of things, and they all sort of cross-pollinate. And then you look up books in that category, and at the side of there's a sidebar that shows what the categories are, and they really dial down, I mean, really, really deep, depending on, and they're separate. There's the books, and then there's the Kindle ebooks. So there's two layers to it, but short answer is, look for books that are your comparables, and then see where they're listed. That was one of the ways. And anything in particular for me, anything that was LGBTQ, I looked to see where does that fit. And then anything with single parents, which again is a much broader field, but it did sit beside MAID for a minute. So that was kind of
cool. Awesome. Well, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that too, about your book hitting #1 in several different categories on Amazon. I'm sure that had to be thrilling.
It was really thrilling, and I'm glad I did a bunch of screenshotting, because it's truly a snapshot. It's a moment in time. It's not, like happiness. You get there and you don't stay there. It's a moment of joy, right? So I really, I'd be lying to say that it wasn't exciting to see that, and to also know that I'm a self-published independent author, and that to see my book at #1 in any category just means that I have done the work, and put it out there. And I have a wonderful community of writers that have been supportive. And, I just read a lot about how to do this right. And, and you don't have to have 100 books a day. I mean, you could sell 2 or 3 books and get back up into that top 5 if the other 4 haven't sold more books than you that day. So the way that it works is not an accumulation of how many you have sold. It's where you're tracking in relation to other books in your category. So that makes a difference. And then after 30 days, you're no longer a new release. And then it's just on those bestseller lists, which is great. I still love when I make it into the top 10. And I didn't do this
fantastic
to make a lot of money, but I wanted people to read it. I want people to understand parents as people. I want all of us as parents to have permission to show up as a version of ourselves that isn't about the roles that we carry, whether it's parent or or partner or daughter or son or mother, whatever. I think it's really important for us to have that. And I had to learn the hard way what it looked like to have a parent who wanted that kind of autonomy, until I was trying to emulate it myself and went, oh, that's what dad was doing.
Well, I think that's such an excellent point, and a great one to end on, of what you were trying to accomplish with this book. And I think it's fantastic that you worked so diligently on this, and studied what it took to release this, and then to be able to have those meet those milestones with it is just great. So how can people keep up with you, and what's next for you?
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Has just been so much fun,
You are
Jan.
so welcome. Thank you so much. It's been a delight having you, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and maybe reaching out to you about my memoir too.
I would love that. You can find everything about the book and what I do and my work at lisalucca.com. And my coaching website is livetruecoach.com. And I am also, my radio show, there's links there too to the archives. And so let's talk about you coming on my show. That would be great.
Yeah, that would be great. And in the meantime, I will just show this one more time. So please go get Ashes to Ink. It is a great read. It's I was just whipping through it. It was very interesting, really engaging, and it really helped me to understand you and your family better. So I think anything that builds understanding is always fantastic.
Well, thank you so much. I had so much fun doing this, Jane. Thank you.
That's great. Well, much success with the book and everything that you're working on, and we will definitely keep in touch. And thank you, everyone, just for watching Author Talks today. Next week, we will be back with Salvatore Merici, who is a poet, and he'll be sharing his new work with us. So thanks again so much. Thanks, Lisa, and everybody. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.